Okay, so with the cabbage on top of the Malzheimer's, I went ahead and wrote the shit down because there was no way I was going to remember all this. Here goes. The Civil War, the Lincoln assassination, the USS Maine, the Lusitania, the Great Depression, Pearl Harbor, the Holocaust, Adolf Hitler, Roswell, Operation Northwoods, JFK, RFK, MLK, Malcolm X, Marilyn Monroe, the Gulf of Tonkin, Operation Popeye, the Tex Watson murders, the moon landing, Jimi Hendrix, Jim Morrison, Elvis Presley, Jonestown, the Iranian hostage crisis, the attempted assassination of Ronald Reagan, the invasion of Grenada, the invasion of Panama, Iran-Contra, Ruby Ridge, Waco, the first World Trade Center bombing, Kurt Cobain, O.J. Simpson, the Oklahoma City bombing, Mena, Arkansas, the Phoenix Lights, Heaven's Gate, Y2K, Ahmed Shah Massoud, 9/11, Osama bin Laden, the assassination of Milton William Cooper, the invasion of Afghanistan, the invasion of Iraq, Barack Hussein Obama, Big Mike, the death of bin Laden, December the 21st, 2012, Sandy Hook, Prince, Kobe Bryant, Cooties 19, the 2020 election, January 6th, Old English 800 back in glass, the demise of Tiny Tim Rousheder, and the real fucking Reek Geeb. That's right, folks. I've been down since fucking day one. And all of a sudden, 2 weeks ago, some fucking douchebag takes a pot shot at President Mr. Trump, and all of a sudden, everybody's a conspiracy theorist. Fuck out of here. Fuck out of here. I've been doing conspiracies since I'm a teenager, and I'm damn near a senior citizen. Fuck out of here. And just for the record, pen pal, since you're looking shit up and you're doing a deep dive on it, you're starting from the wrong spot. It wasn't Crooks. Crooks is nothing but a patsy. The real shooter was a clown by the name of Maxwell Yurick. Look it up. That's all. Number 16.
Airbrushed out important details, refused to allow certain witnesses to speak who would blow his story, intimidated, coached, and really persuaded people to commit perjury, which are all felonies, of course. I mean, the man should not have been allowed to practice law. And most legal authorities look at the case as a disaster, not as a masterful legal procedure, but as the exact example of how one should not run a fair trial. So, but it was only then that I realized the extent that this is all Bugliosi's invention, sort of piggybacking, no pun intended, with the pigs, but on Susan Atkins' original bizarre story that her lawyers, Caballero and Caruso, had concocted. So that's what's important to understand, is Bugliosi was not a great lawyer. There was no defense put on, and the whole trial was really a foregone conclusion from the beginning. Manson had been declared guilty in public opinion because of this earlier killing of Sharon Tate book and all the news stories that basically presented him as guilty. Richard Nixon, the President of the United States, had deliberately, and there is a tape recording of Nixon, which I quote in the book, in which Nixon later admits, he says, "I knew exactly what I was doing when I said Manson was guilty." I believe that's how deep the conspiracy to cover up what was going on was, and how deeply Bugliosi was implicit in pushing a deliberate cover story deceptively.
On his way back to Washington from San Clemente today, President Nixon stopped in Denver to talk to a meeting of law enforcement officials, and then he called a news conference where he charged the news media tend to glorify and to make heroes out of criminals. Reading from notes he had in his hand, he said, unless this glorification of those obstructing justice is stopped, the system will break down. And then the president made the flat statement that Charles Manson, who is on trial for his life in Los Angeles, is guilty, directly or indirectly, of 8 murders. A few minutes later, his press secretary called back and said he was retracting the president's statement because he had failed in referring to Manson, failed to use the word alleged. But by then, the trial in Los Angeles had been thrown into a small uproar.
When you and I discussed Vincent Bugliosi earlier this week, you also told me that there were other ties between the Manson case and the JFK and RFK cases. Is that correct?
Yeah, and to pull back a little and to see the big picture, it's always tricky to make a narrative of history because we like to make things neat and tidy and make sense. But as a working hypothesis for what this is all about, the deeper level of it, you could say that the phenomenon called the 60s began in Dealey Plaza with the murder of John F. Kennedy, which created an uncertainty in authority that had never existed in the USA before. It made people doubt that our leaders are telling us the truth. It created the state of disinformation that we still live in now to an even more horrific degree. It created the causes and conditions of the counterculture, because the Kennedy assassination, at the time when beatniks were sort of a fringe phenomenon on the side of society, and there was the beginning of the anti-war movement, that assassination and the mysteries around it and the killing of Lee Harvey Oswald by Jack Ruby is what made young people doubt their government, doubt that the establishment was reliable, trustworthy. I personally believe that was a coup. But, I don't think we can get into all the details of that. But the 60s began with a murder of Kennedy that was covered up and misreported by the media deliberately to protect the powerful. And it ended with a murder, the Tate LaBianca murders, that, according to the traditional mainstream narrative, ended the 60s. There are so many connections between the two cases that I think if we survive long enough to ever tell the full history of what happened in those years from 1963 to 69, all of the violence, all of the still unsolved assassinations, Martin Luther King, Robert F. Kennedy, Malcolm X, etc., and onwards, to the final blow of the Tate LaBianca murders. If we could ever understand that, you would see that it is one phenomenon of the interlinking of the underworld taking control of American society in collusion with intelligence services in a period of chaos after what I believe was actually a state-sponsored coup. And the social upheaval of the 60s, the hippie movement, what has been called the counterculture, was at least in part a reaction to the Kennedy assassination. And even when you consider, as is well known, the very day of the Kennedy assassination is when the Beatles' first album was actually manufactured. The actual physical album was made that day. So Kennedy died, and that Beatles' first album that was like that was the shot that started the counterculture. They both happened November 22, 63. An interesting coincidence is that Sharon Tate is a Texan born in Dallas, and X. Watson, who murdered her, is also from Texas, and he left to Los Angeles from Dallas. And where was he working? As for Braniff Airlines, he was working at Love Field, where, of course, Kennedy landed before his fatal ride to Dealey Plaza. So there's even that strange coincidence is that the two bookmark murders of the 60s, Kennedy and Tate LaBianca, had this Texan-Dallas connection. Now, the specific connections are, I go into them in great detail and even further in the new edition of the book. I'll just think of some at random. Number one, Jay Sebring, one of the victims at Cielo Drive, and Sharon Tate's ex-fiancé and boyfriend, and perhaps continued to be her boyfriend up to the time of the marriage, up to the time of the murders, knew the Rat Pack, which was the nickname for the group of people, Frank Sinatra, Joey Bishop, Sammy Davis Jr., Peter Lawford, and a few others, Dean Martin, and Jay Sebring was their hairdresser. Frank Sinatra had brought Jay Sebring into show business, and through their underworld mafia connections, because Jay Sebring already was a drug dealer even before he met Sinatra, Sinatra brought him into this circle of Las Vegas underworld entertainment, the Rat Pack. Through that connection, through Peter Lawford, who was John F. Kennedy's brother-in-law, Peter Lawford gave drugs to Kennedy and Jay Sebring this is important, sorry. Peter Lawford acquired drugs from Jay Sebring to give to John F. Kennedy and Marilyn Monroe when they would have their private affair that happened largely at Peter Lawford's home. Jay Sebring was the supplier of those drugs. So he also cut Kennedy's hair. So he was part of this underworld mafia connections that, of course, tie into John F. Kennedy's father's mafia connections, which are very well known. So that's the first connection. Jay Sebring was like the hairdresser and drug dealer to the Rat Pack. Dean Martin, Sammy Davis, he was their drug dealer in the early 60s. And Sharon Tate was part of that circle, because